is. Okay, so everybody's got to click continue that we're being recorded. And I'm going to, oh, Angie, I can't share my screen. She's going to get me hooked up here so I can share my screen in a minute. There we go. And I want this. Okay, now I'm going to try and remember how I drug you down to the corner. There you go. Okay, now all I knew is push that. So I think we're doing good. I can't see you, but hopefully you can see the screen. And please, if you need to unmute quickly, all you have to do is press the space bar. You know, you don't have to hunt around and find that other button. Hold down the space bar, and while you're holding it down, we can hear you. So you can use that to speak. Okay, so last time we talked about the academy, the classical tradition in France that it strongly encouraged. And we also saw near the end of this period, the beginning of the Romantic movement, where we looked at one artist who was challenging that system, who spoke out about that system. He saw the dangers of that system, and he really was an early Romantic artist, someone who was really thinking very differently. And I want to talk about Romanticism today, particularly in the form of landscape art. I don't think I'm going to get through all of this in one day. My thoughts were, you know, not to worry about it. I sort of planned this to take a little while, because it may seem like a simple subject, but it's actually very, very complicated in terms of what landscape means and the role that it played in a lot of different countries. So let's talk about Romanticism, and particularly this idea of the new middle class. Yeah.
Who you said somebody challenged? I wasn't here last time, so who was it?
It was Jericho, Theodore Jericho. And if she can, when Angie gets last week's posted, then the video will be available, so you can, if you want, watch the whole thing. And I'm going to be sure and send you all the handouts, because you were not originally on my list, but I now have you on my email list. So I'll make a point of emailing you the copies of all the handouts, because I don't think at this point that you have them. So
thank you,
I'll make sure
I'd
you
like
get
that
them.
too.
And
thank you.
And if anybody else needs that, you know, let me know. And
Yeah.
I also posted them on online. Okay, so let's talk about it now. Last time we centered around the French Revolution, and we looked at it, you know, what was going on at that time and what was going on shortly after. That revolution had a huge impact, and it wasn't just on the politics of France. It reverberated across the Western world. In art, one of the biggest changes was, particularly in France, how it decimated the patronage system, the traditional system through which an elite class of aristocrats was largely responsible for the commissioning and therefore the style of art. But with the decline or near collapse of the aristocratic class, the patronage system really begins to fall apart. And it's a very different social structure, not only in France, but in much of the Western world, for several reasons. Not only the French Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution is very important, because it is also responsible for reshaping the class system in the Western world. Aristocrats are losing power or disappearing in some places, while the Industrial Revolution is creating this new middle class. And I talked about it last year some, but it's worth talking about again. The way we use these terms, Today, when we talk about the middle class and the working class, we don't really make much of a distinction between them. Most people, I think, today in the West would identify themselves as middle class. Who doesn't think they're middle class? Very, very few. We also think of ourselves as working class. We're certainly not aristocrats who live a leisurely life. So the two words have sort of merged together in meaning. But in the 19th century, they were very, very clear distinctions. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, you primarily had the upper class, the aristocracy, and the working class, who were basically the working poor. There were a few people in the middle, merchants. There were a few other people that could have been considered in between those two, middle class. The Industrial Revolution, however, and the rise of capitalism, because you cannot separate industrialism from capitalism, they are the same thing as they developed. What capitalism did and industrialism was to create a new class later known as the bourgeoisie, who are basically the owners of the factories, the owners of the mines, the capitalists. They are the people who are referred to as capitalists, and they are a new moneyed middle class. The people who work in the factories and work in the mines, etc., they are the working class. So there's a clear difference between middle class and working class. The new enfranchised middle class are not only growing and becoming larger and having a greater voice and culture, but they also have they've also created a whole new cultural system, because they are large numbers of people who have a certain amount of money and they have demands. There are things they want. Prior to this, the only people with money and education were the aristocracy. This is now a different person with a different amount of money available, a different amount of leisure time. And one of the things that comes out of it is a new kind of education. Again, prior to this, aristocrats were educated. They all received what was called a classical education. They studied the classics, they studied ancient history, they studied Latin and Greek, they read Shakespeare, they read Plato, Aristotle. We've now got a middle class that is now demanding education. They're becoming literate. However, they're not receiving a classical education. They're receiving an education that's closer to what we would recognize as an education. It's not rooted in ancient Greek and Latin. It's not rooted in studying sort of high art. So we have a literate class now. Because they're literate, they have new demands in art and literature. One of the things that comes out of this period is a new literature that didn't exist before. Literature before this was things like Shakespeare and Dante and Milton and, great high art, but they don't want that. The middle class doesn't want to read Shakespeare. They just want to read a nice book. So what comes out of this is a thing called a novel, and you start getting new kinds of literature written for a new literate class of people. And there is an equivalent for that in art. There are people who want art. They want paintings on their walls. They want, sculpture, piece of sculpture in their garden, but they don't want the same thing. They're not educated in the same way, and they don't really want the same sort of art. And we're going to see how that dramatically changes the nature of art, and how this thing called the academy, which we talked about last time, begins to redefine itself from catering to the taste of an elite aristocracy to, by mid-century at least, catering to the taste of a new educated middle class. And so the style they support is going to change. And coming right in the midst of all of this is landscape, which is not new, as we're going to see. Landscape goes back to the 17th century in Western art, but landscape in particular increasingly becomes popular with the new middle class because it speaks a language. I think of it as a vernacular language, the common language that is accessible to all. When you think about the art of the academy we looked at last time, scenes from Greek mythology and obscure biblical subjects, you've got to be educated in a certain way to understand what's even going on in those paintings. Those aren't in demand anymore. You don't need that kind of education to understand a landscape or a lot of other subjects that are going to become popular as well. So let's talk about, if I can get this to move, let's look at where, why wasn't landscape happening before this. So let's talk about what landscape is and where it comes from and why we didn't really see it as a major art form in the West. Well, in the ancient world, nature was always considered subordinate to the works of man. Nature played little role in the ancient world. You might have an image. Well, there wasn't a lot of painting, but maybe there's a tree in the background. That's about it. It's forest setting, minimal references, purely decorative. But there was no art that was about nature or about the land. In the Middle Ages, we have a very different situation. Nature began to be associated with sense perceptions, feelings and emotions, which were considered sinful. To the layman in the Middle Ages, fields were all they meant was hard work. It wasn't about joy. Coasts and coastal images meant dangerous storms and piracy. It wasn't a positive thing. They had a really sort of ambivalent relationship to nature in the Middle Ages. There was a general distrust of nature. It was sinful because it was sensual. And this began to change a little bit in the very late Middle Ages with the new popularity of gardens. And gardens and images of gardens began to take on sort of symbolic associations. There are a lot of writers, theologians and writers of the Middle Ages that talked about the sins of your senses. And the more senses something engaged, the more sinful it was. I mean, that was basically it. And so nature, being inherently sensual for many people, was really downplayed and very negative in favor of the spiritual. In the Renaissance, that begins to change because of this relationship between nature and science that was rooted in the Renaissance. They began to be equated, and this new curiosity in the Renaissance led to an interest in nature, but more of an interest in the facts of nature, the biology of it, the botany of it, the science of it, rather than its symbolism or its sensual metaphors, etc. So it was really a science-based look at nature. So you do see backgrounds and maybe a garden in a landscape painting. It's never going to be, in a Renaissance painting, it's never going to be about nature or the landscape, but it will be there. But when you look at it, you'll see it's all about the little details of getting this leaf just right, or this plant in the right environment. It's a scientific view. Now, all of that begins to change in the 17th century, in the Baroque world. This is where, for the first time, we get true images of the natural world. And I'm just throwing a couple in here. I'm not going to talk about these in any detail, although I will remind you of this style in just a little bit. But this is where, for the first time, we see land as a raw material being turned into landscape. And I refer to it as a mediating of nature. Your landscape is something we create. Land is something that exists. Landscape is created by the human mind through a number of different perceptual processes. It's a way of looking at it. We talked last time about this idea of framing, this idea of organizing information. Even the act of perception is conditioned. We don't see anything neutrally. There really is no such thing as a neutral eye. Perception is rooted in a complex perceptual process that takes into account our expectations, our assumptions about the world, our presuppositions that lie beneath those assumptions. We're more aware now, I think, than we ever used to be as a people, how perception is conditioned. We know now that things like eyewitnesses to an account are not something you should take too literally. There have been any number of situations where people have recognized that, 2 or 3 or 4 people observing the same event are going to recall it very, very differently. And it's not because some people are better or worse at remembering, although that is true, but it has more to do with the fact that they're different people and their perceptual systems are different. Understanding our assumptions and how we interpret the world is essential. Many people are aware of the kind of basic belief systems and the assumptions through which they see the world, but we're often not aware of the underlying presuppositions that lie below those assumptions that are often completely out of sight. That's why, arguments, I can't stand, to listen to political arguments. I can't stand to hear politicians arguing, because they're almost never really addressing what the real issue is. They're arguing a surface issue. They're ignoring the assumptions, and when in fact they need to be getting even below those assumptions. Why are you even making those assumptions, to this sort of core belief that lies below it, and we never really get there in discussions. So because of this mediating that we do whenever we look at anything, including nature, what we do when we look at things is we select, we edit. We suppress some things, we make them subordinate, we promote other things because we believe that's more important. Perception is basically an act of discrimination in the fact that we're making decisions when we look at the world about what matters and what doesn't matter. And when you make art, you become very aware of that. I'm a landscape artist. I draw. I don't paint much anymore, but I draw a landscape. So, I'm very aware when I'm looking at a complex scene that I'm making choices. I'm framing it. I'm making decisions about what to include, what to bring forward and put back, what to, eliminate completely because I don't want to be bothered with it. And as my interest in landscape has changed, what I depict changes, because I used to be more interested in the trees, so I downplayed the background. Now I'm more interested in the brush and the background, and I'm downplaying the trees. So I'm looking at the same thing, but it's coming out differently because I'm perceiving it differently. So I think it's important that we always understand that landscape is mediated land. It's even when we get later to the quote realists, even realists cannot see with an unmediated eye. It's an aesthetic process. Perceiving is an aesthetic process. The other thing is our senses and our own identity and our own personal relationship to our environment is also going to be implicated in our response to pictures of nature. It's part of what we choose to see or choose to perceive in the natural world. And it's also very much a part of how we interpret or respond to landscape paintings. Now, while this is beginning in the Baroque period, at this time, images of the natural world are still going to be deeply rooted in church teachings, which are part of the underlying core belief system at the time, and also political systems of hierarchy. So when we, in the Dutch, it's still very, very tied to those external elements. When we when we come to the 18th and 19th century, this is where the modern world is beginning. And this is where I want to look at some of the external influences on art before we start looking at the works themselves, and sort of lay a foundation of what to look for. So certainly the Enlightenment in the 18th century is going to have considerable influences on art, particularly the emphasis on the natural state. You know, the Enlightenment writers, philosophers were very interested in the idea of natural versus artificial, and that's in everything. That's in human behavior. They wondered, you know, what is natural human behavior? They were questioning things like families and how to raise children and marriages and political systems. You know, what is a natural marriage as opposed to an artificial marriage, like an arranged marriage? What is the natural way that a child should be raised as opposed to, you know, sending them off to be raised by a nanny? What is the natural political system in which human beings will thrive? You know, maybe it's not this monarchy. I mean, clearly the revolutions at the end of that century are directly related to the questioning of the Enlightenment. But that's also, you know, the idea of natural is going to play into this new interest in the external physical world. You know, we saw it particularly in 19th century poetry and among the British. You know, Wordsworth's writings, you know, in one of Wordsworth's poems that he wrote in 1798, lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey, is one of my favorites of his poems. He describes the changing relationship of human beings to nature. And it's interesting because the sequence of progression is exactly the sequence I just described, moving from ancient to medieval to Renaissance. He basically says that when we're children, in our childhood, land is a place for pleasure. It's a place of, you know, recreation. It's just a, you know, he says a place of coarse pleasures and physical recreation. It's just sort of out there as a background. And that's not unlike the way it was treated in the ancient world. He says in our youth, it's a place of sensuous refreshment, joys of the senses. And actually in the Middle Ages, they recognized his sensual properties. The problem is they saw that as negative, where Wordsworth sees that as a positive. And then he says in our maturity, it becomes much more complex. And that's when we value it as for its moral and spiritual experience and what we can learn from it. So it's interesting, he's paralleling each person's development in relation to nature with the actual history of the Western world's history with the natural world. Very important idea. Another very important influence on the rise of landscape art is in philosophy, first with German Naturphilosophy. This is a really interesting philosophical movement that lasted from about 1790 to 1830 or so in Germany, but it spread way outside of Germany. It was a response to the dominant Cartesian philosophy of the time. Cartesian dualism. Okay, I don't want to get into philosophy, but the Cartesian dualistic view is basically a restatement of an idea that's been part of Western culture going back to Plato, at least. And that is, when I say dualism, I mean the split between the mind and the body, or the physical and the spiritual. This belief that these are two separate realms, that they do not overlap. That was the dominant view. And it's very different from, say, an Eastern or Asian point of view, which really never split the physical and the spiritual the way the West did. And German naturphilosophy is also rejecting that split, rejecting that dualism. And there's a lot of interesting things written about it. They favored a view that united the physical and the spiritual, that saw all matter as basically a living force. They were not separate things, and they were not separate from the human mind or the spiritual realm. And I see, although I don't hear it talked about a lot, I do see Asian influence, and Asian influence in general begins entering the West about this time. You see Asian influence running a lot throughout the 19th century and right up to today. This is where it really begins. There was contact with Asia earlier than this, but you begin seeing it in philosophies and in other ways in the modern era. And natural philosophy certainly expresses that. So they see humans and nature as a single unity. And also they embrace the Stoic doctrine of a single soul that pervades all nature, which is a very Buddhist concept, actually. So, ideas are emerging. American transcendentalism is very influenced by the German natural philosophy, and it's actually similar in some ways. It's about this unity of all creation, which is what they get from German philosophies and also Asian philosophies directly, I think. But also they believed in the idea of intuitive knowledge, the deeper truths that you can get from experiencing nature, that it was a connection, that it transcends, and that's where transcendentalism comes from, that you can have transcendent experiences through connection to nature that can transcend science and reason. And so one of the things we're seeing in all of this is a sort of pushback, pushing against that Enlightenment idea that man is inherently a rational being, that everything we do is rational, that we do it for some clear rational reason. And there begins pretty quickly to be a pushback against that. And both of these views are a sort of pushback against that idea of rationalism, that there are other ways of knowing and other ways of understanding other than purely rational. And we'll come to that when we look at some American landscape. And then lastly, the Industrial Revolution, urbanization and progress. We've already seen how it created a middle class, but it's more than that. Urbanization really follows the Industrial Revolution. Thousands or hundreds of thousands moving from rural environments to the cities for work, to work in factories. We'll see later, not today, but later, we'll see how this is very problematic. And there were people recognizing the abusiveness of this system from very early on. But this idea of progress is something we'll encounter more later. It's a tricky word. I could go on forever about the idea of progress and what that means. Progress is a term that refers to the nature of change. Last time we talked about Hegel's model for change, how a new model has been constructed in which change takes place through conflict, that one idea, it sort of battles head to head with another idea, there's conflict, and out of that conflict, something new arises that is inherently better than both. Now, what that model presupposes is the idea of progress, that change inherently leads to something better. I mean, that is what we mean by the word, right? When we use the word progress, we're implying that things change for the better. If it wasn't better, we wouldn't call it progress. There's an inherent meaning there, an assumption about change. That's a new idea, that idea that change is sort of driving toward some ultimate goal, that there's some perfect future out there, and all this that we're doing is leading us to that. That's a modern idea. It's just being born. It's born out of the Industrial Revolution, and that's going to be challenged, whether change is necessarily for the better. And it is going to be a major part of what defines modern, particularly as we get into the 20th century, more so than the 19th. So all of these ideas are feeding into this new interest in landscape. Now, before we can look at the 19th century landscape and the great age of landscape painting, which is the 19th century, we want to look at what they have to work from. What are the models that already existed for a 19th century artist to look at and build from? And of course, that would be the 17th century when it begins. And there are basically three major types of landscape paintings from that century. The first is the Dutch, one of the earliest traditions, and that was what was called the natural landscape. When I say natural, and I'll be using this term more, I don't mean that this is exactly what it looked like, because they would absolutely choose and rearrange, and this is a constructed scene, but it's meant to look very natural. They are still working with schemata, and I'm going to talk more and more about schemata, because that is really the great challenge of the 19th century, is to break from that. Schemata are all of these sort of preconceived systems for seeing the world, models for organizing the world through repeated patterns that carry specific associations and meanings. We all have schemata. It's a short word for a long idea, but they're patterns. They're just ingrained patterns. We don't realize we're seeing that way, but we've learned them. They're learned. They're not, it's not human nature, but they're learned, which is why different cultures have different sort of patterns or ways of depicting and ways of seeing the world. This is the Dutch model. It's a schemata. It has a very, very low horizon line. So there's a lot of sky. It will depict human activity, generally work. This is the first Protestant country in the world, really, a Dutch Protestant landscape, and it reflects Protestant values. Absolutely. It's the Protestant ethic, hard work. So you're going to see businesses, shipping, models. There's meaning in here when you know how to read it, when you know how to understand it. So that's one model, the natural landscape, seemingly very natural. The second model, very different from that, is the French model, and that's the classical tradition. Now, as we knew from last week and talked about, classicism is the essential French style. The French have always believed that very, very deeply in their core, true French art is classical art. Classical meaning artificially constructed and generally idealized. And you see that here. It couldn't be more different. There's nothing in this that looks natural. When you look at that painting, you don't for a minute believe that place exists or that it looked like that. It's clearly artificial and invented by the artist. It's perfectly framed. The calm water leads you back. Classical art is very formulaic, and we talked about it in the academy last week. You see the idyllic sort of peasant, the happy peasant tradition in art. That's one other kind of tradition that we'll see where that goes. And then the third tradition from that century was the Baroque tradition from Italy. And that's the Italian dramatic landscape, which is no more natural than the French was, but it's quite different, where the French was very calm and peaceful and unemotional. The Italian is going to be moody, emotional, passionate. That's another tradition. It's energetic, it's dramatic. So we've got three very different traditions from the 17th century. Now, what happens in the 18th century to add to those traditions? Well, one of the most important new elements to landscape art in the 18th is the topographical landscape. And this is purely British. The British contribution to landscape is really profound. The British have a unique view in landscape art. They have a unique connection to their land that's different from anywhere else. The British live on an island. It's a small island. It's very different from France or Germany or America very, very different. It's very limited. There's a limited amount of land. And because of that, in Britain, from very early on, relationship to the land took on power associations. If you were a landowner, that matters everywhere, but it matters more in Britain than anywhere else. The lord of the manor, controlling your land. And that relationship to the land was a unique one because they felt the British connection to the land is very different from anywhere else in the world. And that is they have a distinct proprietorship with the land. The landed gentry in Britain throughout its history and even today, they don't feel that they own their land in the sense that Americans do. For Americans, I own my land. I can do whatever the hell I want with it. Nobody tells me what to do with my land. That's uniquely American. In Britain, they think of themselves as proprietors of the land. They have a responsibility to preserve this land, to pass it on to their heirs. So it's a very different relationship. It's a proprietorship relationship. And that's going to affect how they see themselves on the land. And that's where topographical landscape comes. The one on the right where you see the sort of manor in the distance, they would often commission, it's really a kind of a portrait commission, although instead of a person, it's a building, a home being painted. These are kind of portraits of the maybe cottages on their land, depictions of how they take care of their land. British land is always a domesticated land. There's a domestication that's part of it. You see it in the domestic animals rather than wild animals, etc. So the topographical landscape plays an important role. This is really an archetypal painting of a topographical landscape. It truly is a portrait of a British manor house. It's as if it's, the building is sort of sitting for its portrait. And then this would be hanging like over your mantle in your home. And, you as lord or lady of the manor, every time you see this painting, you are reminded of your rightful position in British society. Paintings like this play a role in validating a class system. I mean, they really do. It's a validation of a class system. Another 18th century contribution is the writings of Edmund Burke, as he, in his philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, he's the first person to challenge this idea of aesthetic appeal being a purely rational thing. He separates beauty and this thing he calls the sublime. Now, he's not the first philosopher to do that. Kant is really the philosopher that really discusses the sublime in really the best, philosophical manner. But Burke is the one who everybody read. Burke is the one who all these British painters were reading. So his influence is stronger, even if he's not really the best writer on the subject. Prior to this, it was assumed that everyone was naturally drawn quite rationally to things that were beautiful. The end. Burke says, wait a minute, no, we're not. We're drawn to all kinds of things that aren't necessarily beautiful. And there are pretty specific definitions of what that actually means. Burke makes it clear. I'm sure you've all heard beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but that's not really true, and it never was. Beauty has a pretty specific definition that runs through literature. It runs through the Bible as well, which follows the same sort of description. Beauty is always seen as something that is fairly, this is Burke's words here, but soft, smooth, and delicate, with gradual variation, not sharp contrast, something that's graceful, something that's regular and fairly simple. He linked it to submissiveness, making the viewer feel powerful. That's what beauty does. He says beauty is something that's bounded and limited. There's really a clear gender basis for his definitions of beauty and the sublime. It's really very feminine qualities as they described them that he defines as beauty, where the sublime is going to be what he associates with masculine qualities. The sublime is things that are rough and irregular, that are vast and boundless, that are powerful. He links it to power. One is powerful, one is submissive. That's very powerful, and it offers the most powerful emotions. I think the clearest description he has, the easiest way to think about it in terms of art, is that the sublime is something that attracts you, but at the same time, it it repels you. It's an attraction and a fear. And what he's meaning by that are, and he specifically talks about land and landscape, things like volcanoes erupting and high mountain peaks and storms at sea. These are things that clearly we're attracted to. In many ways, I see Burke as an early psychologist more than a philosopher, because he's recognizing something in human nature. He's recognizing how we are attracted to things that frighten us. You know, we're much more aware of this today. You know, the theaters are filled with, you know, slasher films and horror films. People go ride, you know, roller coasters for the thrill of it. That's the sublime. That's what he means by the sublime. And it's very different from beauty. It's not that there are different kinds of beauty. It's just that we're not only attracted to beauty. And this is going to affect many artists in the 19th century. And we'll see examples of that. And then in Britain, the third new 18th century contribution, and one that will have a great effect, excuse me, is this thing called the picturesque. And that comes from the writings of Thomas Gilpin. Gilpin wrote a number of essays, and he published 3 of them together in 1792. 3 essays on picturesque beauty, on picturesque travel, and on picturesque sketching. Picturesque literally means like a picture, and he's really looking at art to define nature and nature to define art. It's a strange sort of circular argument. What he's doing is he's merging the ideas of beauty and the sublime, and he's sort of finding a spot in between them. So there are aspects of both in the picturesque, but what he doesn't talk about, but which is there, he's not recognizing what is there. But if you look at both of these images, you can see this idea of nostalgia. There would often be either a little ruin of a building in the background, or a little, like a Greek temple, something that references another time. And this sort of nostalgia being associated with landscape is also very telling of a moment in time, because from the very beginning of landscape painting in the 19th century, artists were aware of thinking of nature as something that we were beginning to lose. Their conservation of the natural landscape was already an issue in the 19th century, and many artists are aware of that and speak about that. And we'll come to that later when we get to specific conditions. So he calls it a kind of beauty that is agreeable in a picture. So I mean, he's literally defining the natural world in terms of a picture, and a picture in terms of the natural world. In the essay on picturesque travel, for example, it's like a little travelogue. He's telling you where to travel in Britain to see the most beautiful picturesque views. So he literally tells you, you know, go down this road and turn here, and then look to your left, and then perfectly framed between the trees is this picturesque view. Now, what he's doing is leading you to a landscape that he's describing based on paintings that he has seen. So he's literally using paintings to construct the natural world in the same way that another essay will use the natural world to construct a painting. So talk about schemata. I mean, this is really seeing the world in terms of a painting and choosing where to look and how to frame. You know, when you look at anything, landscape or anything else, you know, you're making a million choices of where to stand, what angle to look at, what to include on the left and right, how to frame the scene. And so you're constructing nature in that way. It's not an independent nature. It's a created view of painters and trained observers. He's training you what to see in the natural world. That's really what it is. He explained how to create this in your mind's eye. He's explaining how to see this picturesque world. He didn't talk about the nostalgia or the sense of loss, but I think that's still subconscious for him. Now, here's just a couple of other examples of what would be called the picturesque. And again, you're seeing elements of beauty, but there are little hints at the sublime in terms of distances, in terms of the sort of wildness of nature, but there are little elements in it that have a kind of sense of a lost world or a potentially lost world, and all of that is the picturesque. So this is what 19th century painters have to call on when they begin working. And the first 19th century artist I want to look at is a German artist who's clearly one of the earliest romantic artists. And his name is Caspar David Friedrich. And this is not a self-portrait. This is a painting of Friedrich by another artist. But he's working in the early century, the early 19th century. And this is really very early Romantic period. Romanticism is a German movement entirely. It begins in Germany. In the 18th century, it will spread first to Britain. The last place it will appear is France, because the French will fight against Romanticism, kicking and screaming until they have no choice at all. And by 1830, it's too late. The young French are embracing Romanticism, but it's anathema in France, but it's very natural in Germany. It's born of the Sturm und Drang school of literature. It means storm and stress. It's a literature of emotion and drama. So emotion is at the core of the aesthetic experience, and therefore it's very, very personal. One of the key elements of Romantic art is a recognition of individuality. Now, as early as the Renaissance, individualism in art was recognized, compared to the Middle Ages before it. Renaissance artists had a certain amount of individual style and approach to art. But this is a little different. When we talk about individualism in Romanticism, we're talking about something very, very personal. It's a recognition that every artist sees the world differently and experiences the world differently. It's a new understanding of sort of human perception and how different we all are. And relating to that, if every artist is different in what they see, then every viewer is going to see a work of art differently, is going to understand it differently. Prior to this, it was kind of assumed everybody saw the same thing. Work was either good or not good. There couldn't be different opinions about that because everyone, there was right and wrong and reason. And if it's reasonable, we all see it, right? But that's not the case. And so this is also the period that gives birth to art writing and art criticism, people expressing opinions about art. There were no opinions about art before this. You either got it or you didn't get it. You were either right or you were wrong. Now there are varying opinions, and one's not necessarily right and the other necessarily wrong. We're recognizing difference. That's very important because Romantic art will be very personal, and there will generally be a strong point of view being communicated by the artist. The other thing I want to say about Friedrich is he is painting, this first work we're going to see is while Germany was under the control of Napoleon. All of these states, which are part of what we call Germany, had been conquered by Napoleon. So he's living in a place and speaking about a land that has a foreign invader on its property. And that's going to make a difference in terms of how he sees his land, particularly after Napoleon's defeated. We call it Germany, but understand there was no Germany at this time. Before Napoleon before Napoleon conquered it, it was about 5 major states that came together. After Napoleon leaves, it breaks down into about 20 different independent states. And we'll talk about that when we get there. But this is a painting, an early painting. This is while Napoleon was still in power. One of the things that Napoleon did to in Europe, it's often said, is that he created the idea of nationalism, that there was no real nationalism in Europe prior to Napoleon. You know, historically, people had loyalty to individual leaders. But as far as nations, nationalism, that really didn't exist. That's a post-Napoleonic concept, and he created it by conquering and then being conquered. And this is when people began to speak about nationhood and taking pride in the nation, not just the individual who happened to be ruling at the time. You really kind of needed a post-monarchy world. It needed to be after the revolution and then after the empire. Now nations exist apart from divinely inspired kings or all-powerful emperors. That they're gone. Now it's nation. And so that's going to inspire nationalism. And nationalism and Protestantism both filter into Friedrich's style. It is his interpretation of the sublime, strong religious component, and topography is giving way to symbolism here, and this sort of moralizing theme. This particular painting, Cross in the Mountains, is full of symbolism. Without a specific narrative, but he does talk about the symbolism. He explains that the evergreen trees symbolize hope because they're undying. The setting sun symbolizes Jesus's departure from the world, or you could see it as the passing of the old order. The light in the back is the sort of light from heaven. Certainly he's influenced by topographical views with the hilltop cross that you see. The elaborate frame, there's sort of wheat. On the lower part of the frame, you can see there's sort of wheat, and on the right are grapevines. That's a symbol of the Eucharist, the wine, and the host. It's overtly romantic in an overt point of view, but an early work. This is the Friedrich that we look at more often. That's really showing us the way forward. This is a really interesting painting. It's very unique at the time, very ahead of its time by a lot. I would be, if I really didn't know Friedrich, this painting or anything, and this was just shown to me without any context, I would probably have put this in about the 1880s or 90s. It's much more akin to what we're going to see at the end of the 19th century in the symbolist movement. But obviously that's not when it was made. Monk by the Sea. First of all, let's look at the way it's composed. It is a landscape format. It's horizontal, slightly exaggerated horizontality, and it's created by basically three horizontal bands: the sky, the water, the land, in these very stark, dramatic, empty spaces, with this single little vertical, this tiny little figure standing down there, who we know is a monk. Now, he's written about this. He's told us that this monk is standing on the edge of the sea, and he's contemplating his own death. He's thinking about his death, and he's using this sort of negative spaces, this vast space, to really speak of this sort of vast emptiness. And this is the essence of the sublime. Burke actually, when he's describing the sublime, he talks about vast spaces and why he considers them sublime. He said it's because they force us to contemplate our own mortality. Whenever we're faced with the infinite, we have to acknowledge the fact that we are not infinite, that we are mortal. And so any sort of scene that suggests this vast, empty, infinite spaces makes us feel tiny and vulnerable. And there is a bit of an existential element here as well, in that vulnerability of that poor little figure. So he's using these forms, these vast horizontal sky, water, and land, as a kind of metaphor for the void, the great unknowable out there. This is a poor, single, lonely soul contemplating this vast unknowable and his own death. It's a very powerful image and a very strong use of form to communicate that. I mean, with very minimal form. I mean, what is on this? One big strip, one strip, and one tiny figure. There's really nothing in this painting. It's very minimal, and yet it communicates really powerful ideas. And actually, this idea is going to be addressed by a very important later artist in the 1960s. And I'll remind you of that at the time, because he's very influenced by this. There's a second work that actually goes with the monk. They're what we call pendant pieces, and a pendant piece means that the two of them were literally meant to hang side by side. They're the same size, and this is the pendant piece. It's called the Abbey in an Oak Forest, and this represents the funeral procession of that same monk. So in one, he's contemplating his mortality. In the other, we're seeing his death. And again, it's full of symbolism. There's a bit of the nostalgia in here with the ruin of the church, these gnarly tree limbs. He talks about the sunrise in the background, which is sort of the idea of hope, symbolizing hope. Perhaps a homecoming, the religious longing for peace and salvation. But people have also linked it to the Napoleonic period. You know, is it, you know, symbolizing hope for the nation, for a redeemed nation? You know, it's hard to know exactly what is in his mind at this time.
Peggy, why is this romantic?
Exhibited in 1810, and both works were bought by the King of Prussia. And it really brought great fame to Friedrich. This is really where his work took off. And he was admitted to the Berlin Academy shortly after this. I haven't talked about it, but we will encounter other academies. You know, the French Academy, 1648, but not long after that, there's a Royal Academy in London, there's an academy in Berlin, there's a Munich Academy. There are actually several academies in Germany, the Academy of St. Luke in Rome. So there are other academies than the French Academy. But I think his greatest works are the ones he does after the liberation, after Napoleon is finally defeated. And he's especially known for his Rücken figures, like these two. Rück in German means back. So a Rücken figure, basically a figure seen from the back, you know, just like a Rück in Germany, a backpack is called a Rucksack. So it just means a backpack, literally. So why is he showing these, you know, prominent figures with their back to us? Well, I think it's perfectly obvious what he's doing. We're supposed to identify with them. You know, it's like they're pulling us into them. It's like they are us standing there in front of this vast space. I mean, this is the essence of the sublime. This is especially the one on the left. I mean, I think that's phenomenal, the Wanderer. Look at this guy. He's in his, you know, he's this gentleman in his long gentleman's frock coat up on the top of this mountain. Like, how the hell did he get there? You know, he didn't climb this mountain dressed like that. We're not supposed to really think about it in that way. He's just there. We're just supposed to meant to identify with him. But it's, again, this infinity of nature. And what makes these desirable is this sort of vicarious thrill that we want, that we seek, we enjoy. This is a dangerous place. I wouldn't want to really stand in that place, but I can get that vicarious thrill, that sublime thrill, through a painting, through imagining myself. It's vicarious, it's safe. Same reason we watch movies, same reason we ride roller coasters, because we know they're safe, but we can get that dangerous thrill. And that's part of human nature in the same way that our attraction to beauty is. And the one on the right, the woman in front of the sun, again, having having very, very strong religious overtones. Both of these do, art as a form of worship in a way. It's very much a Protestant, especially the one on the right. The light is what gives it that religious aesthetic more than anything else. And then something like this, where we see a sort of Protestant religious feeling versus Catholic pageantry. It's a rejection of that pageantry. I wanted to show this because of its overt German nationalism. And you may not recognize it, but it was clear to anybody at the time. The figure on the far right is wearing a hat. It's a very specific kind of hat that was German and associated with nationalism at that time. So while, you know, it's completely lost on us today, this was seen as a very patriotic painting because of this hat that he's wearing. And it really takes the meaning into another realm, into a kind of political realm in terms of the birth of this nation and hope and all of these things that are associated with the period. Before I go on, does anybody have any questions or comments on anything that I've talked about so far?
Peggy, is this romantic? These things, are they
Nothing?
romantic?
Okay, that's okay.
Did you hear me? Hello?
So we'll move on and talk about
Peggy, Peggy,
the British.
Peggy.
And before we look at the
Peggy!
landscape, I want to talk about
She
John
must
Ruskin.
have her
We're gonna
sound
run into
off and
John
doesn't
Ruskin
know
again
it.
later
Hey,
in the
Peggy,
class. It's a
Peggy.
very important figure, a writer, an
Can't
art
hear.
critic at the time.
Peggy,
And Ruskin was a huge supporter of Turner, the artist we're going to look at in just a moment. And I included in the handout, and if you didn't get it, I will send out copies again. But there's an excerpt here from something he wrote in 1844. Ruskin is fascinating and as a person in terms of his impact on the art world and in London during this whole century. He later would be a great supporter of the pre-Raphaelites, and even later he's going to get into a very, very famous lawsuit with Whistler when Whistler sues him and it becomes scandalous. There are other scandals he was involved in, but Ruskin's a fascinating person, extreme moralist. And the reason I put this excerpt in the handout is because it's such a great representation about what's going on in London at the time among the artists there. As I said on the handout, it says the battle between the ancients and the moderns, the struggle with schemata. But what is that battle between the ancients and the moderns? A phenomenon that is true in all British art is that the British have always had an inferiority complex in regard to the visual arts. The principal art form in Britain for centuries has
hey, Peggy.
been literature.
She's not
No
hearing
one
me either.
questions British literature. They've got the greatest, they've got Shakespeare,
I
they've got
don't know.
Milton, they've got, you know, many, many other great writers, but the painters have
try to
always
call her?
felt inferior to that.
Did you
And
call her?
especially
I'll call her.
to the so-called ancients and masters of the past. When they say ancients, they don't literally mean ancient Greece and Rome. They basically mean anybody that came before them. Everybody before them are the ancients and they are the moderns. And it's really fun to read 18th century criticism and things that artists have written. You know, they try and explain why their work isn't as good. Particularly, I'm thinking of like Renaissance artists. They always believe they just can't be as good as the great Renaissance artists. Those were the ones they were modeling themselves on. And there were really interesting arguments that said, well, it was because of their climate. That was one of my favorite arguments, was that the British art isn't that good because of their climate. To make really good art, you need a warm Mediterranean climate. you have to have certain sun in order to be great, but which is an interesting argument because it just tells you how they just feel, put upon by these ancients. And Ruskin here is going to take exception with that in the context of landscape. And the first paragraph is all about him talking about how, well, all those landscape painters of the past, they weren't all that good. And they weren't that good because they didn't have any sort of moral influence on mankind. It appears to me to admit of considerable doubt whether art has ever possessed anything like efficient moral influence on mankind. The utter inutility of all that has been hitherto accomplished by the painters of landscape. No moral end has been answered. Morals coming up over and over again. No permanent good has been affected by any of their works. Landscape art has never taught us one deep or holy lesson. It has not recorded that which is fleeting. I'm going to come back to this. It has not recorded that which is fleeting, nor penetrated that which was hidden. Now, I want to remind you, last time we had this reading from David at the Academy, where he attacked the idea of fashion and things that were fleeting. The generation before this in the Academy, you didn't want things that were fashionable and were fleeting. Art was supposed to be timeless. It was supposed to be unchanging, the same. Now we've got Ruskin attacking art that wasn't fleeting, that's now an important thing. Not interpreted that which was obscure. It has never made us feel the wonder, nor the power, nor the glory of the universe. Well, that's an interesting description. Wonder, power, glory. That's very romantic as an idea. That's got nothing to do with classical art. It is not prompted to devotion nor touched with awe. That's sublime. Touched with awe is one of the things that Burke describes as sublime. Its power to move and exalt the heart. Paris. Okay, that which ought to have been a witness to the omnipotence of God has become an exhibition of the dexterity of man. That's quite an attack on the previous artists. And he's attacking them on moral grounds. Clearly, he believes art needs to have a moral message. It needs to do something, accomplish something. Now, the next paragraph, he elevates the moderns. Nobody's elevated the moderns. All anybody has done before this is talk about how, well, make excuses for why they weren't as good. That's what British writing did. It made excuses for why British art wasn't as good as Renaissance art, why it wasn't as good as Baroque art. Now, finally, someone's coming along and saying, wait a minute, it's better, or at least some of it is. He says, modern landscape painters have looked at nature with totally different eyes, seeking not for what is easier to imitate, but for what is most important to tell. Rejecting at once all idea of imitation, thinking only of conveying the impression of nature, interesting wording, and looking for its truth. Essential and impressive truth in the works of 2 or 3 of our leading modern landscape painters. He won't go farther than that, but 2 or 3 of them are pretty good, is basically what he says, than the old masters. Now, that's an interesting point, because he's talking primarily about Turner, J.M.W. Turner. This is the person he thought was the greatest British landscape painter, and many people today would absolutely agree with him. Certainly Turner's right up there with all of them. Now, Turner was a fascinating person. This is a self-portrait of him. Turner, first of all, should never have made it as an artist. He should never have been successful given who he was and where he came from. It was almost an impossibility, and yet he did it. He maneuvered the system. He's the only, as far as I'm aware of, the only working class artist with Cockney manners and accent to manage to operate within upper class institutions And he was more successful than many of his peers who were born to the appropriate class. Now, what I mean by that is almost all artists, successful artists, are born to the upper middle class. That is the class that paved your way toward a successful career in art. There are almost no artists born of the aristocratic class. I can only think of one successful aristocrat, and there was a good reason why he managed to be successful. The reason is aristocrats are born to obligations. Their paths in life were set for them, and it was virtually impossible for them to break free from those expectations and those patterns. Working class, for obvious reasons, simply didn't have access to the educational systems, to the things that were needed to be successful, where upper middle class gave you connections to higher classes. It also gave you the money that was needed to have the leisure time and get the education you need. It simply made sense. So how did this working class guy manage to become so successful? It had to do with the fact that he was extremely precocious. He was an exceptional artist very, very early on, and everybody saw that. And that opened doors for him. You know, when a 14-year-old comes along and is already successful in having a career in art, that is important. That opens doors. He decided to be a professional at the age of 14, and he entered the Royal Academy School. Now, the Royal Academy in London was organized very much like the French Academy in Paris. It was not as rigid. However, it was very similar in many ways. It had a school associated with it. It had academicians. Later, you would be accepted. It even had the same number of members. Remember, I said the official academy in Paris, there were only 40 members, and they couldn't take on any new members until somebody died. And they even chose the same number of 40 members in London. So that's very similar. Now, he was admitted to the school, the academy school, at the age of 14, which was unheard of. The typical age for admission would be between 18 and 20, and then you generally spend much of your 20s studying, just like in Paris. And then you hope at some point later in your life, maybe that you'll be admitted as a full academician, but that doesn't always happen. So he's entering at 14, and he's with primarily 20-year-olds, and he's winning the prizes. You know, even at 18, he won a landscape prize at that age. They did not have the Prix de Rome prize. They didn't have that sort of competition. That's uniquely French, but they still had a lot of prizes. He began to sell, he was selling his work by the age of 16. He was selling watercolors. It's another thing that's very different from between the British and the French. Watercolor plays a really important role in British art. British watercolorists were often in Paris, a lot of British artists studying in Paris. The watercolor tradition is deeply rooted in British tradition, and Turner was both a watercolorist and worked in oils. But there was a real demand for watercolor, like topographical paintings. He sold a lot of those. He would do sketching tours and do watercolors and sell a lot of those. So there was a real demand, and watercolor is a great technique for landscape painters. So very successful early on. At the age of 27, yes, 27, he was admitted to full membership in the academy. He was an academician at 27. Most people are in their 50s, 60s, 70s. No, truthfully, most artists don't get admitted at all. And those that do are usually later in life. So he was fortunate in the sense that a position came open. Very, very precocious. This is a really interesting watercolor. This is watercolor, by the way. Salisbury Cathedral, seen from the cloisters. It's its influences are clear. Yes, topographic, it's accurate, but it's very romantic, and it's also, very picturesque. The sort of ruined arches that you're looking through. I mean, that's very romantic, and the ruined architecture is very picturesque. So he's sort of framing it. He's using the broken architecture to frame the scene and create a very popular effect in terms of the imagery itself. He was also a very shrewd businessman. He was successful because he really ran it like a business. I think his whole attitude was different. Being a working class person, he didn't take this as sort of a dilettante practice. He was a businessman. It was a career. It was a job. And his father, actually, much of his life was like his manager. I mean, he really had like a dealer, a manager that took care of him. Most artists didn't do that. But, because he needed the money early on, he turned it into a business in a way that most artists didn't. I would imagine that a lot of other artists look down on him for that, because that would have been seen as very sort of coarse and very working class to do. But nonetheless, that's what he did. This same year in 1802, briefly, the war with Napoleon sort of took a temporary hiatus, and he was able to travel again. The Napoleonic War, now, it started back in the 18th century, and it's not going to end until 1814, and then again in 1815. So those first 15 years of the century, there's not a lot of travel. It's not easy to travel through Europe. So, and travel is important to landscape artists. So this hiatus, this ability to travel. So in 1802, he went to Europe, and he traveled around Switzerland and France, and he did hundreds of sketches, drawings, decidedly romantic. He also stopped in Paris and visited the Louvre. The Louvre had just recently opened as a museum. Napoleon turned the Louvre Palace into now a museum. It had been the home of the French Academy for a long time, but now it's an actual museum. And he stopped and visited that and saw a lot of art that he hadn't seen before. His sense of nature, and here's one of his works after he returned. This is very Turner. This is very Turner in style, the shipwreck. His sense of nature was very different from Friedrich's, was not mystical or spiritual. It's very physical. I mean, this is a very, very physical take on the natural world. He is someone who really gives form to the elements. He's really driven by, air, water, land, etc. And fire, although we don't really see fire that much in his works, but he really gives them physical form and turns them into the essence of the sublime. Now, this is his sense of the sublime, which is less spiritual, more physical, and very, very threatening. Now, the one thing that I mentioned before, and which I always tell my students, is whenever you look at a landscape painting, right, ask yourself, what relationship does it suggest between man and nature? Where a classical landscape suggests a very subdued nature who behaves the way you want it to, a sublime landscape is just the opposite. It's an all-powerful nature that can kill you. Sometimes you have a symbiotic relationship. This is not symbiotic. This is one where you're going to die because this is a terrible storm and you are nothing in the face of nature. This doesn't read like God. This isn't God in nature. I don't see anything in this painting that suggests that. That would be suggested by the light, and that's not suggested. This is pure, raw nature itself, and it's very much that sublime effect. There are a lot of 19th century paintings of shipwrecks. It's one of the more common themes throughout that century. For fairly good reason, there were a lot of shipwrecks. They made the news. We already saw last week, we looked at Jericho's raft of the Medusa that sank. That's one of the hundreds of scenes of shipwrecks. In this one, it's, you know, it's generic, it's mythological, it's not referencing any specific thing, but the way he gives physical form to that water is really unparalleled. There's no one who can do that the way Turner is able to communicate that. This is certainly one of his most famous paintings, really quite different, right? He's jumped into another realm. He doesn't always work in the same way. This one is really quite different. And he considered it his masterpiece. It was painted in 1815, right after the fall of Napoleon. This is the sort of final fall of Napoleon. And it's hard to not see it in this context. The subject, Dido building Carthage, is a subject from Virgil's Aeneid, the Roman writer Virgil, and his story called the Aeneid, which is a story of the Trojan hero Aeneas and his travels after the Trojan War. It was written as a parallel to Homer's Odyssey. Homer's Odyssey is the story of the Greek hero and their return. This is the other side. This is the Trojan hero, because the Romans identified with the Trojans. So the Roman version is the Aeneid. And in one of the many stories, adventures along the way, he stops in North Africa, where Dido, the queen, is building the city of Carthage. The subject we see here is another subject that's popular in the 19th century, and we're going to see it again in a very important context. That is the rise and fall of empire. Anyone at the time reading this title immediately is aware of what's happening and knowing the history. The Carthage built the greatest empire in the world, the Western world at that time, and it was destroyed by the Roman Empire. So any reference to the word, just throw the word Carthage into anything. You write a poem, you throw in the word Carthage. It's loaded with meaning. And the meaning is about how empires rise and how empires fall. And certainly in the 19th century, anything related to empires and empire building is a powerful message, because this is when empires were being built around the world. Especially the British, but also much of the rest of Europe, and in America, the American Empire. So we will see how all this plays out. So it's already, while a landscape, it's a historicized landscape. And what we mean by that is it's elevated, it's more important. It's not just some random bunch of hills and water. It's a powerful place. So there's a story being told about the landscape, and that elevates it. That's what was encouraged in art, particularly in France, less so in England, but nonetheless, he saw it as this masterpiece. Now, he's creating real depth here with perspective, the two sides diminishing in the difference, pulling your eye way back, and then this powerful light in the background. Now, Turner was a professor of perspective. He taught at the Royal Academy, and he taught perspective, and it's very likely he's very consciously demonstrating his skill with perspective to carve out this kind of space. But he's modeling it on one very famous painting, and that was the 17th century painting by the great French landscape painter Claude de Lorraine. He was the most famous landscape painter of that century. This was considered a great work, the Embarkation of the Queen of Sheba, and Turner is clearly modeling it on that. Now, this painting by Claude was in the collection of the Royal Academy at that time. what Turner is doing, however, is while it's similar, it's not the same. Claude's is 17th century, it's more classical, it's more linear. The surface of Claude's painting is very smooth and refined. There's no brushwork visible. Turner's is more painterly, meaning there's more brushwork visible in the scene. He's also carved out a deeper space. He's giving you this light in the background. It's as if he's trying to outdo the great Claude, because that's how Claude was. This is what I meant when, when Ruskin talked about the ancients and the moderns, that's what we're looking at. Claude would be one of the ancients he was talking about. It's a beautiful painting. It impresses the eye, but there's not much of a message there. On the right, it's about the rise and fall of empires and warnings about empire. It has, at least that's how Ruskin would have seen the two. And again, it's like Turner standing up and saying, we're not gonna try and argue why we're not as good. We are as good. Look, I'm outdoing the great Claude. And to make that point even grander, and you can see here, when you look at it more closely, you can see there's more texture involved. It's not slick, smooth surface. It's more painterly, more sensual because of that, as a romantic painting should be. And there's the reference to the historiated. But the one thing that Turner absolutely insisted, Turner left a will when he died, and he left all of his art to the nation. Now we'll talk more about that later because it was contested. But the one thing he stipulated is that you can have all my paintings that are in my possession when I die, but you must hang my Dido building Carthage next to Claude Lorraine's Embarkation of Queen of Sheba in the National Gallery. You must hang them together. Now, nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever sort of held the nation to ransom saying, I'll give you this, but I'm going to control how this is seen forever. It's not only now can you compare the two, forever I want people comparing me to Claude and deciding who's better. And today they hang next to one another in the National Gallery. He got his way. That's how important Turner was in Britain at the time. When the Napoleonic Empire finally collapsed in 1815, travel was opened up, possible again in the 1820s. And he worked on fewer large oils, but enormous output of watercolor. Topographical, picturesque views from all over Britain, hundreds of them. He also traveled in Europe again and started making what he called color beginnings. And these are examples of color beginnings. He just did hundreds of these. They're thin watercolor washes, and they're slightly suggestive of land masses, but they're not really finished paintings, and he would set them aside. Later, he'd select them, and they'd become the foundation of a study, which would then be turned into paintings. So it's an interesting way of quickly collecting hundreds and hundreds of quick studies that you will later use in your art. And watercolor allows you to do that. Now, here's one of his later works, one of his finest. I just love this piece, his Snowstorm. By this time, he's 67. I mean, he is a major figure. And all of his many, many years of watercolor are really affecting his oil painting, because the techniques in a painting like this are merging different styles. There are thin washes that come out more of a watercolor technique that he's applying now to oil. This is an oil painting, but he's working with it as you would work in watercolor, and also other more traditional techniques. This is almost abstract. Some of his paintings are so abstract as to almost be unrecognizable. And that's because of, he's focusing on the elements, and you get all these sort of swirling forms, and material forms are dissolving and disappearing, and the like. It's a metaphor for nature's power, in a sense, that it's overwhelmed by these elements. Turner's impact on art is most profound a little later in the century. He does have quite an influence on the Impressionists. And you can see that when you look at a painting like this sort of dissolving of form, and this sort of awareness of the surface of the canvas is something we'll talk about in Impressionism. But nonetheless, it is becoming quite abstract in a way. So again, this was in the Academy exhibition of 1844. He had 7 different paintings in, and he's reducing landscape here completely to the natural elements. That's it, the 3 of them. No fire in here, but the 3 of them. And I think his most modern work, the work that speaks the most to what is modern, is this work, which is unusual for him in some ways, and others not. You've got the boats and the ships, but there's nothing more modern at that moment than the railroad. And again, he's really combining here the thin washes and the thicker. Impasto is thick paint that builds up on the surface. Rain, steam, and speed, the Great Western Railway. It's actually depicting a bridge, an engineering feat, that railway bridge that this train is sort of coming straight at us. I'll show you a detail in a minute. You can see it better. But this bridge was very famous. It was new. It was the most incredible engineering feat at the time, to be able to build this long bridge, high bridge. He brings into it the natural elements as part of the sublime. The whole construction of railroads, the speculation in railroads, this was everywhere at the time. Railroads symbolized the most modern, it symbolized industrialism, but the essence of the modern world. And there was good reason for it. Nothing changed the way people lived their lives more than the railroad. And not only cross-country railroad, but as we'll see later, commuter railroads, like within cities, changed how people lived as well. And that's important. By this time, he's pretty much a constant traveler. And so the railway is an important part of his life as well. And to me, nothing speaks more of modernity than these elements of nature that are wild and dangerous and out of your control, and then coming out of that is this powerful man-made thing. Nature isn't crushing this railroad the way nature crushed those ships that were about to sink. This is more powerful. This is charging right out at you, and it speaks to something man-made, like the will of man, like breaking through this cloud of elements. I think it's a powerful image. Here's a detail of the train. You can see how loose this is. This is a painterly technique. You see build up on the surface, you see, and even the way he suggested movement. I love the back part of the train back in here where you see all these tires, or wheels, I should say. It's almost like stop action animation or something. I don't read it as like just each one of these is a different wheel. It's like it's moving so fast, there's a blur. That's how I read it. So he really gets this sense of speed and energy as well. His health began to decline soon after this, and he withdrew a great deal. He went to live in the country, really to get away from people. He was very famous. I mean, he was a celebrity. He wanted to get away. So he went to the country with his lifelong mistress, and they never married. That was not actually that unusual in the 19th century, especially among artists and others. He actually hid his identity when they moved to the countryside. He used her name. He called himself Mr. Booth, which was her name. And then, as I said, he bequeathed all his works to the nation when he died in 1851. What's interesting is he had also bequeathed a lot of property, but his family sued, contested the will and sued. And in fact, they won. So they got his property, but the nation got all of his art, which is an early example. It's one of the earliest examples of an artist's estate suing over someone's works, and it has become a much, much more common thing. Not so much today, but it was very common in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Families, you know, an artist dies, there's going to be a lawsuit. It stopped becoming significant because I think artists figured out how to write wills better, or how to do it in such a way that it wouldn't, their wishes wouldn't be contested. But this is one of the earliest examples of that happening. And then the last British artist I want to look at is John Constable. This is a portrait by Ramsay Reinagel, not a self-portrait. Constable and Turner are almost the same age. They're like 1 year apart. I think Constable's 1 year younger than Turner. They work in very different ways, both very British, but very different. Constable was more the typical sort of upper middle class. He grew up in the countryside of Suffolk along the Stour Valley. His father was a wealthy agribusinessman. He owned several mills, granaries, docks, barges, etc. The classic capitalist upper middle class. So he had a typical upbringing. He had to fight for his right to be an artist. I mean, he was 27 before his father finally agreed to allow him to be a full-time artist. So he grew up in a countryside, but a very privileged countryside, none of the hardships of the countryside. His art is a mixture of observational detachment and personal investment, as everything is really. He wanted, you know, he desperately wanted to create a natural landscape, or what he called the natural landscape, but he struggled more than anyone with schemata, with these fixed ways of seeing that he wanted to break away from, but found it really hard to actually do. His art is a regional art, and this is an outdoor sketch. I'll talk about it in a minute. I know he limited himself to sort of the area he grew up. I mean, Turner travels the world and he depicts all sorts of different things. Constable, on the other hand, really stays in a fairly small region, depicting places that he knew very well: canals, fields, mills, cottages, all really surrounding his father's property in East Anglia. His scenes were kind of inscribed on his memory, and a memory with a very romanticizing eye. You know, Constable's view of the English countryside is a view through rose-colored glasses. He's not seeing what was really happening. It's a memory of a child, an idyllic memory of a child. He, you know, like Turner, he did want to elevate landscape. He would do studies like this. Now, this is an outdoor oil sketch, which is more typical. It's not a finished painting in any way. It is painted outdoors, completely outdoors, but it was never intended to be a finished painting. You know, artists at this time still absolutely believe that paintings are made in a studio. You know, you may go out and do all the sketches and studies you want, but you go back to your studio under controlled lighting, and that's where you make a painting. That's still the system, that's the belief. Now, as a teen, Constable sort of educated himself. His father didn't really support him, so he really didn't get to go as a young man to the academy school. He does go, but he goes late. I think he's 24 when he starts there, which is very, very late. Before that, he's self-trained. You know, he's copying paintings, he's reading theoretical treatises, and still not 100% known whether he's going to be able to commit himself to this career. But he does, at the age of 24, begin studying. Now, remember, Turner was 17. Turner's practically only a few years away from being admitted as an academician, while Constable is still at the school learning. So a little bit slower, but he finally does get approval. You know, his doctrine was truth in all things. The problem, and he abhorred artificiality, but he knew this was going to hurt him in his career. He knew that the public had expectations. The public has ways of seeing landscape, and they want to see it in a certain way. So he struggled to free himself from these habits of arrangement, habits of seeing, but they were an important part of the English sensibility, including things like the picturesque. Now, I want to show you how he gets from an outdoor sketch through a conceptual sketch. So this is the outdoor sketch. He's working quickly. He's trying to get down some basics before the light changes. You know, if you're a landscape painter or a drawer or whatever, that's the biggest problem you face, is the changing light. It changes so fast. You've got to get something done within 30 minutes or the whole thing is going to look different. So he's working quickly to lock down this image with vague impressions. Then he creates from that what he calls a conceptual sketch. Now he's rearranging things. He's sliding it over a little bit. He's adding, he's removing, he's mediating nature, right? He's taking it somewhere else. And out of that comes this, which is the finished work. Now, what's interesting is how it got to this point. What you're seeing now is a much more polished image, much more framed, composed. The surfaces are more refined, less harsh detail. This is where you get to when you want something that will sell. You know, here's the three of them. You know, start out in the upper left with the quick sketch, and then the conceptual sketch where you consciously move things over, bring things in. Clearly, he wanted that building on the left to be more prominent. He didn't want that tree to be right in the center, so he moves it a bit to the left. And then from that, the refined, finished piece, which really lacks the sense of light that you get in the outdoor sketch. It is always going to be different. When you're working outdoors, you capture a different sense of light. This work was a commission. This is a classic example of an early Constable, Wivenhoe Park. This is land as proprietary, and it's one of those topographical in most ways. He takes it a little beyond being just topographical because the building's just sort of peeking out from behind, but you can really see where it comes from. This was a commission, the man who owned Wivenhoe Park, and it's about 200-acre park. Now, park, of course, doesn't mean like a public space, the way we use the word. Park refers to the lands of a private manor. So 200 acres around this manor house is private property, and he was commissioned to record this. But it's very, very British. I swear you could show me this, and I'd never heard of it. You could show this to any art historian. This could not be anything but British. This is so British, it could never pass for being made anywhere else in the world. This view of nature. It is a domesticated, it is a civilized world. It is a world that existence of man is minimal. You get a bit of on the right, the sort of fisherman. It speaks of a kind of perfect idyllic world, domesticated animals. It has boundaries and borders. It's a controlled world, and that manor house and whoever's in it at the top of the hill, they're the controller that controls this world. It just speaks of all things being well. It's a powerful statement. You know, he's chosen a dramatically horizontal format. It's wider than the normal expected proportions, and that creates the feeling of vastness, that it goes on and on in all directions. What this painting doesn't do, however, is give you any sense of what was really going on in the British countryside. This is overlapping with the Luddite resurrection. The Luddites, of course, was a movement in Britain, and sort of anti-industrialist movement. There were riots in the British countryside. They destroyed textile machinery factories. They feared loss of jobs. There was arson in the countryside and rioting. Market prices had collapsed after the end of the Napoleonic War. The British country was in chaos, and you see nothing like that in this painting. This is the painting of a little boy who remembers his idyllic childhood, and it's a real place, but it's seen through rose-colored glasses. This is the essence of romanticizing. He's glorifying it. In fact, the real world I just described is the nightmares of the real world were really unthinkable in this world that Constable has created, in this sort of filtered rural world. You see no poverty, you see nothing. Because of his growing family, he had 7 children in 12 years. It was a real burden. And so he was feeling the pressure to conform, to create works for exhibition, to create works for sale that not everyone experienced, you know. But he knew if he created what he wanted to create, they would be unpopular. So he was really torn. I mean, he was a man who really struggled with what he needed to do versus what he wanted to do. He began in 1821 doing what he called skying. And you see some examples of it here. That's basically just paintings of the sky. They're studies of the sky. Forster's book, really the first real popular book on meteorology, was published in 1815, and this is the first time like clouds were labeled. It had illustrations of different clouds, and Constable was very influenced by that. And we know that because in his sketchbooks, he labeled his clouds, he labeled different kinds of clouds with their scientific names. So we know he was familiar with this book, and it began changing his art. You really begin to see it in his paintings. He started at this time really looking for a series of subjects that he could use to exhibit. And this is when he began developing what he called his 6-footers. And they're called that for fairly obvious reasons. It's 4 foot by 6 foot. He has a bunch of them. They're a standard size. These are paintings that were devised purely for exhibition. These were he pushed his natural style as much as he could and stayed with the schemes that were expected, and was quite successful with these based on a series of different oil studies. And the Haywain is probably the most famous. It originally had another title. Originally, he was going to call it Landscape Noon, but then it got retitled the Haywain in 1821. And this is a very important painting, a very influential painting. It didn't affect a lot of young painters in London, but it had a huge effect on French artists. He exhibited this in 1824 at the French Salon exhibition, and that was a really important moment. A lot of young French artists saw this. So his influence is actually greater in France than it was in England. Turner's influence will be seen later in the century, but Constable's is seen pretty quickly in French landscape, which is something we'll look at next time. So what do we have? We have what's meant to be a natural landscape. There's also a lot of Dutch influence here, very influenced by Dutch landscape. You know, the asymmetry, the low horizon line. Look at these clouds. These are the most believable clouds he's painted yet. And that's because of his studying meteorology, his clouding paintings. And it really gives a whole new energy to the sky here. And I think it's a very important part of this work. But we get, you know, the idyllic sort of farm worker here, the domesticated animals, the cute cottage. So again, it's a domesticated, peaceful world that really denies the reality of what's happening at the time. I actually have a photo that was taken of that exact spot. It's interesting to look at what it looks like today versus his painting. And we have to ask ourselves, it's interesting, the cottage is clearly still there. Has it changed that dramatically? Or was he romanticizing what he saw? Now, clearly trees can be cut down and trees can grow, but it really is a very different, you know, the real image on the right doesn't have anything like the grandiosity of the one on the left. But I'm thrilled that someone found this spot and published this photograph so that we can get a sense of what something looked like, because rarely does that happen, that we're actually able to find anything. When this was exhibited at the French Salon in 1824, it won a gold medal, and because of that drew a lot of attention. Yes, this is what he wants to paint. You know, if he had his way, this would be a finished painting and not an oil sketch. This is more of what he wanted to do, more emotional, more dramatic, and less, you know, composed. You know, when he finishes it, this is what ends up getting exhibited. And while I love this painting, and it is wilder than his earlier work, it has more energy to it. The surface is more sensual than his earlier work. When you see them together, there are differences. He's brought in little elements to balance it, like that boat on the left and that mast. He had to put that there to create a balance with the trees on the right. That's an artificiality. He brought that background up forward a little bit more. He left some things out, he added some things in. That's what you do, you know, in the composing phase. But nonetheless, it's clearly the similar scene. It's a beautiful painting nonetheless. This is my favorite. I love his late work. There is a thing called old age style. There are art historians who've done studies of this. Artists appear, well, as I've gotten older myself, I recognize the phenomenon. There's a freedom that comes with getting older, right? There's a sense of being more yourself. You know, you're freed from all those earlier, you know, concerns about what other people think, etc. And in art, that takes a particular turn in, for most artists get truer as they get older. They become more who they are, and their true personality tends to come out more, because in general, they're less concerned about pleasing other people. And I think this is phenomenal. This is one of my very favorites of his works. It certainly has a strong romantic, emotional, personal quality to it, but there's a lot of movement and texture and energy on the surface. It's much less refined than some of his earlier finished pieces. Dedham Vale, another series he did a lot of. The Dedham Vale series tend to mostly be vertical, or a lot of them do. And a vertical landscape, as we saw in the first class, sort of pull you into the scene. They psychologically pull you back as opposed to pulling you out to the side. So this is a beautiful piece. And then I have to show you the one in the Nelson Gallery. This is a very late piece. It's a large piece, 45, 52 inches. So next time you get in there, take a look at that. His works very later works tend to get darker, heavier paint, rougher slashes, darker color, closer to his rough sketches, as this really is. And they also tend to seem to take on a bit more sort of metaphorical metaphorical quality to them, more like an inward expression. They're moody. Whenever romantic art gets more moody, then you start reading into it symbolism and associations, more ominous, more romantic. So it is a very late Constable that we have at the Nelson. So in summary, then, his oil sketches came close to his personal goal of natural landscape, more so than the 6-footers, or more so than the works he had to make for exhibition. He faced this sort of contradiction that so many landscape artists had to face, the conflict between being spontaneous and natural and depicting an artifice of composition and finish of execution, which were expected by those who saw and purchased your work. And for him, I think it was always a problem. I don't think he ever reconciled the two. I think it preyed on him. Not all artists are bothered as much by it as Constable, but he was definitely bothered by that to a great extent. And we'll see, how this plays out with certain French artists later. But I'm not going to do that today. What we have to do next time then is look at the French and the American, and that will take us right up to realism. So does anyone have any comments, questions, anything about this?
Can you hear us this time?
Yes.
Can you hear us?
I can't, I wait a minute. My speaker turned off again. Hold on.
I know.
I'm sorry. My speaker, something wrong with my speaker. It turned off. I
It's
hope
been
you're.
on the whole time. We were trying to.
So you can hear us now?
Yes, now I can hear you. I am sorry. I don't know how to. You can't yell at me and tell me because I can't hear you and I couldn't see you.
It was kind of funny.
Oh, I feel terrible. I'm sorry.
That's okay, but it was funny trying to get your attention. And
Yeah, I couldn't see any of you. You weren't on my screen. So
we
You
just
could've-
yelled at one another for a while.
Yes.
you could wave at each other, but I couldn't see a thing.
And I was texting you and calling and
Oh, yeah, and I turned my phone off so it wouldn't ring. And I didn't want it disturbing the class. I don't know I can't think of any way to solve that. Unless,
That's a heavy-handed way to say, hold your questions till the end.
yeah, just shut them off. No, but I really didn't want to do that. Okay, I just unplugged my speaker. Somebody talk to me. I want to see what you sound
Okay,
like.
can you hear us now?
Yeah, I can. I'm not going to use my speaker anymore. That's it. Problem solved. I just won't use the speaker. I'm sorry. That was my problem. I wondered why nobody was saying anything. I really
We
did.
wondered how long it would take you to wonder enough to pause.
I wondered if there was anybody there. I thought,
Yeah,
oh
yeah.
God, they all left. I just know it. They all hung up and left.
Yeah.
That's it. Oh,
Paranoia sets in. Oh my God, the class left.
I
Yeah.
told you I could talk.
Yep. Well, we already knew that.
Yeah, well, now you really know it.
we
I've
were all
demonstrated.
mesmerized. We couldn't.
Oh.
couldn't
Great
stop.
class though, Peggy.
We're happy
So-
to
Really
laugh
good
at your
job.
expense.
So let's go back. You can remember what you were going to comment on. We can do that, but now you probably forgot. Just make notes next time if I don't listen.
Well, I've got a question. So you said there was only one aristocrat that you could think of. Was that Toulouse-Lautrec?
Yes, very good.
Oh,
Absolutely.
Henri.
Yes. And Toulouse-Lautrec at the very end of the century. And he made that possible by, being physically disabled. His family didn't want him, didn't need, I wouldn't say they didn't want him. They didn't need him to take his position. And so that gave him freedom to do what he wanted to. But he's the only one that I can think of. There may have been more, but I don't know him. Oh God, you guys, I'm so sorry. Okay.
I just really enjoyed the depth into all this English landscape and the interpretation of it, because I've never gotten very involved with it, and so you've opened it up. So
Good. Yeah,
I
it's
loved
more
it too. I loved it.
complicated.
I like that you tied it in with the literature and the philosophy and what was going on politically at the time.
But Peggy,
Yeah.
I have a problem, and it may very well be my own problem in seeing, but in Turner's Salisbury Cathedral,
Uh-huh.
looking through the cloister,
Right.
the perspective in that, just if I had that on the wall, I would go crazy because I could not make the perspective come together.
And he was a professor of perspective. He's
Well, I know, I'm sure I'm not seeing something right, but
right.
The arches of the cloister simply won't work for me.
You're
Now,
probably
it may be that I just, you see, they
Well-
just don't work. If you bring the broken parts together,
this curve and that curve.
if
These
you
curves.
fix it, it's not right.
Well, I'm not
Ah.
sure where
My eye wants to bring it together.
you want to
There are
connect
pieces
these two.
missing.
Yeah, my eye wants to do that. It's like seeing a word
Right.
trying to spell. My eye just constantly.
Yeah, I don't know what it would have looked like, because there are various ways these could have connected, I guess. That could come down.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't know.
I thought maybe it was the angle, but I can't make that work either.
well, I
Oh,
think that it's
analytic.
just so artificial. It's like you're seeing a movie that was made in a big studio against a painted background.
It's
Well, I like the picture itself. My eye gets stuck there and I can't get past it.
I think it's certainly possible that he invented this whole thing. I mean,
Oh, I'm sure he did. That's
he's
fine.
accurate with the cathedral, but this is for effect and some sort of dramatic effect. But he still should have got it accurate. I mean, he's a professor of perspective. There's no way he should have made an error in perspective, but
I'm not even accusing him of that. I'm just trying to see it.
trying to see it. I never thought about it. I mean, I just looked past it. I never tried to make that fit before, but you're right. If you try to, it's a problem as to
Yeah.
how it
It's
actually.
one of those
connects
things
it.
that once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Right. Peg, are you trying to say something? Because I thought you were trying to.
No, I was actually looking at my notes to see if I could come up with the question that had been posed. And it had something to do with what made, I think we were at Cross in the Mountains, what made that a romantic painting?
The Friedrich, which
I think so.
the cross on the mountain, is that the one?
Yes.
Okay. It was, ooh, there we go. Wait, he's back here.
There.
This guy. It's romantic because it's emotional. And the lighting makes it very romantic. It's very personal interpretation. There's passion behind it. It's not so much like a specific composition or a specific design. It's the motivation that makes it romantic. he wants you to, he's manipulating your emotions. You know, he wants you to feel a certain way, and color more than anything. The romantics know how to use color to make you feel certain ways. And more than anything, the color is doing that. But yeah, it's very emotional. Anything else, anybody?
No.
Well, my
Thank you
humble
very much,
apologies.
Peggy.
Well, I think
Hey.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm just amazed that this guy was from the lower class, Turner, and
Yeah.
you know, he was 14, and I mean, it's almost like a rags to riches story.
It's exactly, yeah.
I just wonder if there was some kind of wow, underhanded I don't know. It
Well,
just
there-
seems so, I mean, implausible that that could happen.
It was very implausible, but it was also, and I didn't talk about this, but not everyone could have done that. It was a unique combination of circumstances. His unique ability of being so precocious at an early age, people just couldn't ignore that. But it was also his personality. He was, even though he was this Cockney and he had this horrible accent, and you know how the British just can't, you know, the class system and accents and all of that, but he was apparently so personable, like everybody really liked him. You know, he just got along with people. He was good at working people. He was good at, he was just one of these guys that you liked, and you were darn good. And he was he was more successful than Constable, who was born in the right place. And, you know, he had everything that should have put him in success, but Turner had it. You know, he had an incredible self-confidence. I mean, he had to, right? He had to have a strong ego and self-confidence from a very young age. I mean, just the idea of all this international travel at his age. I mean, who's brave enough to just go off and do that? You've got to be very confident, especially this kid from, you know, working class. So it was a unique situation, and not many people could have pulled it off, but that's part of what makes him and his work interesting.
He had
Well,
charisma.
And also
Yeah.
at the end of it, you know, he wasn't, he asked for the moon and he got it.
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
as far as, you know, hanging that one painting against the, what
Against
was it, the Queen of
Claude.
Sheba?
Yeah. Yeah, he knew he would get, I mean, the ego, he had to have a huge ego, but not in an obnoxious way. I would call it self-confidence, because ego is usually, too big an ego is a negative thing interacting with people. But if it takes the form of self-confidence, people respond very positively. And like you said, charisma. And yeah, so his accent, I think at some point it even made him stood out. I think it ended up even being a positive thing in some ways, because it set him apart from other people.
I
And
can see this as a movie.
yeah, me too. I could see his life as a movie. It would make a great movie. Absolutely could see it. They'd have to add.
Artists need to struggle like Van Gogh, though, don't they? This just wouldn't
No,
work.
that's a matter of opinion.
How many Van Gogh movies?
That's
have
a
been? Three,
that-
four?
That idea is that's a romantic idea. That's an invented model. That's based on the Hegelian dialectic, right? Change from conflict. Great. That's what, you know, the reading we had last week, that's what Jericho said, is that great artists need a struggle in order to get better. That's something that's an idea that begins in the Romantic period. It's something born of Romanticism, that art needs to come from struggle. You know, a few thousand years before that, you know, that wasn't the case, and nobody thinks that today. That's a modern concept. It's not a postmodern concept. It doesn't exist today, but it is a myth, a mystique that developed. And yeah, I don't personally believe that's true at all, but nonetheless. Okay, everybody, if there's no more questions or commentary, hopefully we can be in person next week. And if you can come in, please, if you're comfortable coming in, do so, because we can have discussions better. But I will never use my speaker. I'm throwing this thing out. It's never supposed to do that. Just shut off on me. Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.